So apparently there's been a partial ceasefire to allow a humanitarian corridor out of both Mariupol, sorry, I screwed that up, and another town whose name I cannot pronounce and I'm not familiar with. So I will focus on Mariupol since I have been trying to follow the situation there quite closely since it became clear that that is going to be the next city to fall, or at least that's going to be the next city targeted by the Russians. It might take a long time to fall because, for those of you familiar with Ukrainian geography, it is a major city on the Sea of Azov, the sea from which the Azov Battalion derives its name. It is a city that is a stronghold of the Azov Battalion. So these are essentially the Waffen-SS of the Ukraine's Wehrmacht. These are the most passionate and fierce soldiers, the most ideological soldiers, the people who hate Russia the most. And so I think that they will probably not give in very easily. Even if they know that they're defeated, a lot of them probably would opt to fight for the death, and those who would choose not to fight to the death may just be executed on sight. I doubt that they will be allowed to leave. From what I understand, the Azov Battalion is not even allowing male civilians who wanted to flee to do so, even before the Russians had arrived. Just people who were fleeing, because they were worried about the Russians, because they knew that the Russians were going to surround the city. There was a Western journalist who left, I believe it was Mariupol, and she reported that when she was leaving, she witnessed a Ukrainian man who was not allowed to leave by the soldiers there. But nevertheless, women and children should be free to go. That's not a perfect situation. I think that forced conscription is slavery by definition. But at the very least, you should get the women and the children out, right? Well, unfortunately, according to I believe it's the deputy mayor of Mariupol, which, has been the source of a lot of the information coming out from the Ukrainian side about the city. I don't know why the regular mayor is not giving updates. I don't know. Maybe this deputy guy speaks English or something, and so maybe that's why he's the one talking to the press. But either way, he has confirmed that the humanitarian corridor, which was established just a few hours ago, had been shut down within an hour or two, because apparently he's saying that the Russians are not honoring the ceasefire, and that we're being told that the civilian convoy, or civilian, column, the Trail of Tears, is being shelled by the Russians. Now, I've been looking for pictures of this, because I think that's a pretty remarkable claim that the Russians would, agree to a ceasefire and say, hey, we need to have this humanitarian corridor to let all the civilians out, so that, we're not fighting in a city that's, full of apartment buildings that are all occupied, only to then attack the civilians on their way out of town. How does that serve Russia's interests? Why agree to the ceasefire at all? Why do agree to the humanitarian corridor if you're just going to try and massacre the civilians? And after all, isn't Russia trying to, conquer these areas and rule them themselves? Why would they want to just kill people like that, wantonly? How are you ever going to control an area, and govern it, or establish a government there, that is affiliated with you, if the people remember, hey, those are the guys who bombed innocent women and children as they were trying to flee a war zone? And so it just doesn't quite sound right to me, especially when I factor in the analysis of Alexander Mercurius, who has been comparing the Russian movements in Ukraine to that of the war in Syria, which it appears that the Russians, are conducting a very similar war in Ukraine to that of Syria. It's been a very interesting analysis. I would recommend you all go listen to either Alexander Mercurius's own channel or his the Duran, Duran, in which he outlines this theory, because something that we've been absolutely devoid of in the Western press is any sort of rational analysis of what the Russians are doing and what their goals are. We're just being told these individual little things. Oh, Russia committed this atrocity, or Russia committed that atrocity, without any logic to any of it. Because during a fog of war situation, you're going to get a lot of false reports, you're going to get a lot of correct reports, and you don't know which are which. So it helps to have some kind of logical framework to try and piece together, okay, does this make sense? Does that make sense? Because when you hear claims that are presented without evidence, if they don't make sense within, reasonably within, an established logical framework of what the Russians are trying to accomplish and what they're doing, you might be able to write those claims off until you get, concrete evidence. So it's not to say that this framework is dogmatic and that, because it doesn't make sense within, what we think the Russians are trying to do, that didn't happen. It just means that, if you don't have any evidence to back it up, it would be hard to fathom. Whereas, something that fits within that framework, even if the evidence is kind of shoddy, you can somewhat believe it and say, okay, at least that kind of makes sense. So to summarize this framework briefly, what happened in Syria and what Alexander asserts is likely to happen in Ukraine is that the Russians will surround a city. They will create what they call a cauldron, which they will then progressively heat up, through at first making minor skirmishes, shelling, whatever, but cut off those forces, cut off those militants in that city from the outside, so that there is no hope for them, to receive additional supplies and whatnot. Similar to a siege, but with these humanitarian corridors to alleviate some of the pressure within the cauldron, get some of these civilians out of there so that you're only putting heat to the militants, and then eventually the goal is to use these same humanitarian corridors to evacuate the militants, because what you want is a city intact. You don't want to, level a city a la Iraq 2003. You're looking to remove the unsavory elements, your enemy troops, from this city, and then take it over yourself. And so what the Russians did in Syria, once they got the militants to surrender and extracted them, after, of course, evacuating the civilian population first, then turning up the heat on the militants within the city, so the city was just, in the case of Aleppo, all that were left there were jihadis, for the most part. That was the idea. And then once they get uncomfortable enough and realize, hey, we're just stuck here in a cage, we can't do anything, they can say to the Russians, or in that case, the Syrians, we surrender, let us out, and then they can be evacuated to a remote location, which is sort of a safe haven for jihadis, in that case, Idlib province, which is occupied by the Turks, who have been sort of the patron saints of Syrian jihadists since the beginning of the civil war back in 2011. And Idlib has essentially been turned into an exclusion zone where they can extract all the jihadis, put them there, and then the rest of the country doesn't have to deal with them anymore. And so Alexander asserts that this is probably what the Russians are trying to do in Ukraine, and will use, Old Galicia, which I've referenced numerous times on my channel, the old Carpo-Ruthenia or Galicia. It was an Austrian province, or actually, it wasn't a province. It was a constituent kingdom of the Austrian Empire. And its capital was Lemberg, known today by the Slavic name of Lvov. What do you want to call them? The Azov guys, and perhaps at some point Ukrainian military guys in general, will be eventually evacuated to the west, to Lvov and surrounding Galicia. And these humanitarian corridors are an integral part of that strategy. It's important for the Russians, if they're going to get people out of these cities, that people trust the humanitarian corridors. if people feel like, hey, if I take the Russians' offer and I walk through this humanitarian corridor, if I feel like I'm going to get bombed, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to sit in that city forever, which does not serve the interest of the Russians. And so that's why I'm skeptical of this claim, that they had to shut down the evacuations because the Russians were bombing the civilians as they were trying to escape. Why would they do that? Because if they can't get the civilians out of there, they can't get to the final step, which ultimately will be to extract the Azov battalion guys. And even if the Azov guys, refuse to surrender and there has to be a bloody battle to the death, in other cities, they will be able to extract the soldiers and send them on their way to the west. And so the reason why I think this explanation makes sense is that we have seen a very similar Russian encirclement of these cities without the Russians going in and actually trying to take these cities. Early on in the war, we saw these images of 3 Russian vehicles at a time going into a city and then getting attacked and having to retreat, and these vehicles were being left behind, and you thought, like, what is this about? That couldn't have been like a real attack. They didn't have air support or anything like that. Those were kind of just like little probes. Because obviously the Russian army has, enough firepower. If they really wanted to take a town by brute force, they could. They could go ahead and level a city. They have that capability. But that is not what's in their best interest. And that's a good thing. We don't want total destruction and annihilation to be in the best interest of the Russian army, because then that's what they would do. We have seen footage of one town near Kharkov, which does appear to have been leveled. It was a small, or I shouldn't say a town, it was a village. Very, very small settlement. But the whole thing's gone. All the houses are rubble. And I think they said there are 5 dead people. And there were bodies. And this is a Western news report, but they showed the bodies, so I believe them. And if the Russians wanted to do that to Kiev or Kharkov itself or Mariupol, they could. And so whatever the reason is that the evacuation stopped this morning so quickly after it began, I imagine that the Russians will be working overtime to try and reestablish that and to try and gain the trust of the local authorities. Because the sooner that they get the civilians out of there, the sooner they can go in and try to conquer that city. Now, the only evidence that I saw presented to try and confirm this claim that the Russians were shelling the humanitarian corridor was a passenger train that was empty, that was apparently hit by a shell, and you could see that the railroad tracks were damaged, and so you cannot travel along those tracks, along that line, that section of the line, until the tracks are repaired. That's all that I saw that was presented. Did not see any. You would think that in this humanitarian corridor, all these people walking the Trail of Tears, there would be people with their phones out, and they could, video and get the message out. If they were being shelled by the Russians, they could take pictures of the craters. There would certainly be, injuries. Yet all we're seeing is an empty passenger train, one train car, I should say, that was hit by some kind of artillery fire, and it damaged the tracks. Now, with all that said, is it possible that the Russians are just blatantly trying to massacre these civilians in the humanitarian corridor? Yes. That is possible, and if I see evidence of that, I would admit that, I would tell you that, and I would probably link to it in the description, but I've not seen that yet, and if they did do that, that would certainly not be in their best interest, and that would be unwise, to say the least, of the Russians. So, that's my update today on Mariupol. I would expect that this will progress in time. This will take a while, but I think that ultimately the civilians will make it out of that city, hopefully unharmed. So I will see you folks back here tomorrow.